The teletype machine in the corner of the small, smoke-filled office clattered to life, its rhythmic thwack, 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 cutting through the damp Moscow quiet of late April, 1980. For Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Grishin, a GRU analyst assigned to the 8th Directorate Spetsnaz Strategic Reconnaissance, the sound was an annoyance. It was late. He was tired. Most of the traffic this time of night was routine signals intelligence from naval patrols or satellite pass-downs. He let the paper spool out, the Cyrillic characters marching across the page, until a priority code caught his eye. Flash. Eyes only. Tehran Residentura. He tore the sheet from the machine and held it under his desk lamp. The words made no sense. It was not a report of a coup, or a missile test, or a border skirmish. It was a jumbled, frantic cable about helicopters. American helicopters. Burnt. In the middle of the Iranian desert. The report was fragmentary, compiled from an informant within the nascent Revolutionary Guard. It spoke of a secret American operation, a failure, a catastrophe. It mentioned 8 heavy-lift helicopters, multiple transport planes, and a significant number of American commandos who had simply vanished. Grishin felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a military operation as he understood it, this was something else. He carried the flimsy paper down the hall to his colonel's office. The colonel, a grim veteran of the Taman Guards, read the cable twice. He looked up at Grishin, his eyes betraying nothing but a deep, profound weariness. "Get me the satellite imagery from Quadrant 22, Delta, Block 15, he ordered. "And wake up the signals team at the embassy. I want every whisper from the American traffic." Within hours, the picture became clearer and infinitely more confusing. The site, designated Desert 1 by the Americans, was not a battlefield. It was a staging point. A disaster. A collision between a helicopter and a C-130 transport. But as more GRU agents and attaches made their way from Tehran to the abandoned site, the reports they sent back became less about the failure and more about the things they found. They found 5 intact, abandoned Sikorsky RH-53 DC Stallion helicopters. These were not standard transport machines. They were painted in a strange, non-reflective desert camouflage. Their avionics were heavily modified. Inside, scattered across the cabins, was equipment that made the analysts in Moscow blink in disbelief. They found lightweight body armor, sleek and form-fitting, utterly alien compared to the heavy, cumbersome, steel-plated Zvezda vests their own Spetsnaz teams were issued. They found strange, modular webbing and vests, allowing soldiers to carry ammunition and gear in ways that seemed customized to the individual. Then came the weapons. There were standard M16 rifles, yes, but also Kar-15 carbines, shortened, compact, and fitted with suppressors. There were heavy-caliber sniper rifles and modified M1000 911 pistols. But most terrifying of all were the goggles. The initial reports called them night eyes. Photographs soon followed, showing bizarre, binocular-like devices attached to helmet mounts. They were divided by PVS-5 night vision goggles, a generation beyond anything the Soviet Union possessed. The Soviets had their own night vision, of course, bulky, heavy, active infrared scopes that required a massive battery pack and projected a beam of light visible to anyone else with night vision. These American goggles were passive. They amplified the ambient starlight. They allowed the wearer to see in the dark as if it were day. The implications were sickening. An entire unit of soldiers who could own the night, moving and fighting while their enemies were blind. The story of the impossible event was not that the Americans had failed. The failure was a tactical detail, a stroke of bad luck and mechanical failure. The true mystery, the one that had Colonel Grishin and his entire directorate working 20-hour days, was that the Americans had tried. They had launched a rescue mission from an aircraft carrier over 800 kilometers into a sovereign, hostile country, landing in total darkness, with a force designed not to conquer, but to extract. The Soviet doctrine had no equivalent. If a Soviet ambassador had been taken hostage, the response would be political. If that failed, the response would be overwhelming. An entire VDV, airborne division, would be mobilized. Tanks would roll. It would be an invasion, a massive hammer-blow operation. The Spetsnaz role in this would be to perform reconnaissance, assassinate enemy leaders, and sabotage command centers ahead of the main invasion. They were the sharpened tip of the spear. This American force. This was the entire spear. It was a scalpel, designed for global surgical intervention. If you find this kind of deep dive into Cold War history engaging, consider subscribing to our channel, Cold War Impact. We explore the forgotten operations and technological rivalries that define the modern world. The bafflement in Moscow deepened. The GRU analysts and their KGB counterparts at the first Chief Directorate's Department 5, which handled Spetsnaz operations, began to wargame. They put their own elite units Alpha Group and the newly formed Vimpel against this theoretical Delta Force, this phantom unit the Americans had apparently deployed. The results were not good. The Soviet model was built on centralization. A Spetsnaz team was lethal, but it operated on a rigid plan, authorized from the top. Its members were supremely conditioned athletes and demolition experts. They were trained to follow complex orders perfectly. But these Americans, the gear they left behind, spoke of something else. It spoke of individual initiative. The modular vests suggested operators picked their own loadouts. The modified weapons suggested a culture of personal customization. Anatoly Grishin wrote a report which was promptly buried by his superiors. In it, he argued that the Americans were developing a new philosophy of warfare. While the Soviet Union was building more tanks to fight a great land war in Europe, the Americans were building a force that could bypass the front lines entirely. A force that could strike directly at Soviet influence, anywhere in the world. They could, he wrote, attempt to extract a high-value defector from a friendly capital like East Berlin. They could sabotage a Soviet naval base in Vietnam. They could land on the roof of the Soviet embassy in Beirut and extract a KGB resident, and we would be powerless to stop them. His colonel crossed out that last line in thick red ink, calling it alarmist fantasy. But the question remained, echoing in the halls of the GRU and the Lubyanka. Who were these men? What was this Delta Force? The Americans had been humiliated at Desert One. The world's media called it a fiasco. But in the quiet, classified offices of Soviet intelligence, it was seen as a terrifying statement of intent. The impossible event was a calling card. It was the debut of a new kind of war, a war of shadows, technology, and surgical speed. And the Soviet Union, for all its might, had just realized it was standing completely flat-footed, blind in the dark while the enemy was learning to see. The hunt for answers, the desperate scramble to understand this new phantom, was about to begin. The 5 abandoned sea stallions were a treasure trove and a nightmare. They were flown by Soviet pilots very carefully to a secure airbase outside Moscow, where they were disassembled, piece by agonizing piece, under the blinding lights of a GRU technical hangar. Every component was analyzed. The rotor blades were sectioned, their composite materials scrutinized. The engine turbines, coated in a strange, heat-dissipating ceramic, were X-rayed. The navigation computers were vivisected by technicians from the Ministry of Radio-Electronic Industry, who were stunned by the density of the microcircuitry. This was not a simple helicopter. This was a flying computer, a low-level penetrator designed to be invisible to radar, to itself, and to the ear. But the real panic was centered on the goggles. The AN divided by PVS-5 units were rushed to the Optika Design Bureau, the heart of Soviet optical research. The chief engineer, a man who had won the Order of Lenin for developing the optics on the T-64 tank, held the lightweight device in his hands with a mixture of awe and revulsion. He and his team spent a week reverse engineering it. Their report to the Politburo was bleak. The American device, they wrote, used a Generation 2 image intensifier tube. The Soviet Union was barely mastering Generation 1, which produced a grainy, distorted image and required a significant amount of ambient light. This American tube was smaller, lighter, and thousands of times more sensitive. It didn't just amplify starlight, it could practically invent an image from the photons bouncing off a blade of grass. The military implications were catastrophic. A Soviet DSHB, Air Assault Brigade, relied on night for cover, for regrouping, for massing its forces. Now, the night belonged to the enemy. An American soldier wearing these goggles could spot a Spetsnaz patrol from 500 meters away, dispatch them with a suppressed weapon, and be gone before the first body hit the ground. The night, which had always been the great equalizer, was now an American-owned battlefield. The hunt for Delta Force began in earnest. It was a full-spectrum intelligence assault. In Washington, KGB agents from the 1st Chief Directorate's Line R, Operational Support, and Line X, Scientific and Technical, were given a single top-priority directive: find Delta. They were instructed to bribe clerks at the Pentagon, to blackmail low-level contractors at Fort Bragg, to search every unclassified defense journal and procurement request for a single mention of the unit. They found nothing. It was as if the unit did not exist. There was no line item in the budget, no recruitment poster, no training manual in a public-facing library. The American military, usually so loud and boastful, was silent. The men who had been at Desert One were ghosts. They had been absorbed back into the bloodstream of the US Army, leaving no trace. This silence was, for the Soviet mindset, the most terrifying thing of all. In the Soviet system, everything was documented. A new unit required a new designation, a headquarters, a commander, a political officer, a mountain of paperwork. The absence of this bureaucracy was inconceivable. It implied a level of operational security and decentralized authority that the GRU and KGB, mired in their own internal rivalries and rigid hierarchies, simply could not comprehend. Back in Moscow, the Desert One incident began to mutate. It ceased to be a failed operation and became a legend, a bogeyman used to frighten new recruits at the Spetsnaz training center in Ryazan. Instructors, themselves deeply unsettled, would devise new, impossible training scenarios. "Comrades!" an instructor would bark, pacing before a line of exhausted trainees in the pre-dawn gloom. "Tonight, the Delta is your enemy. You are guarding this fuel depot. You have 2 machine gun nests, a BTR-70, and a full platoon. The enemy is 6 men. They are invisible. They see you, but you cannot see them. They carry weapons that make no sound. Their helicopters land with no noise. Your task is to survive until dawn." The exercise would be a failure. The enemy role-players, drawn from the best of the Vimpel unit, would attach simulated charges to the depot and kill half the platoon before a single shot was fired in return. The trainees were learning to be afraid of the dark. This paranoia infected the highest levels of strategic command. If the Americans could try this in Iran, where could they not try it? The KGB ordered a review of objective security at high-value sites. Suddenly, the perimeter fence at a nuclear research facility in Sarov or a command bunker outside Minsk seemed hopelessly inadequate. How do you stop an enemy who can fly over your fence, land on your roof, and see your guards before your guards can even see each other? The response was typically Soviet. More concrete, more wire, more guards. They were building a fortress against a phantom. In the vacuum of hard intelligence, theories multiplied. The Soviet leadership, steeped in a culture of maskirovka, military deception, could not believe the event was as it seemed. The first, and most popular, theory among the general staff was that Desert One was a probe. The Americans, this theory went, had never intended to rescue the hostages. They had intentionally sacrificed the helicopters and the lives of their men to test Iranian air defenses and, more importantly, to gauge the Soviet signals intelligence response. Had the VVS, Soviet Air Force, scrambled MiGs from their bases in Afghanistan? Had the GRU activated its listening posts along the border? The entire operation, seen through this lens, was a brilliant, cynical piece of electronic warfare. The abandoned equipment in this scenario was a trap state-of-the-art, yes, but perhaps with subtle flaws or even tracking devices designed to mislead Soviet scientists. The second theory, popular within the paranoid halls of the KGB, was that Delta was not an army unit at all. It was a political weapon. The CIA, they argued, had created a disposable unit of cowboys for deniable operations. The name Delta Force was a piece of meaningless theater. The real unit was a black-budget CIA entity, a successor to the failed Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, designed to conduct assassinations and foment coups. The helicopters at Desert One were just a cover story. This theory gained traction because it fit the KGB's worldview. The enemy was, like them, a creature of intelligence and subversion. But the most dangerous conclusion, the one that Anatoly Grishin, now a junior colonel, railed against in his classified memos, was the one reached by the industrial military complex. This was, they concluded, purely a technology gap. The problem was not the American soldier, who was seen as soft, undisciplined, and reliant on comfort. The problem was his toys. The solution, therefore, was to copy the toys. The Soviet Defense Ministry poured billions of rubles into a crash program to close the goggle gap. The Optica Bureau was given a blank check. The goal was to have a Soviet-made Generation 2, equivalent within 5 years. They would copy the American night vision, they would copy their lightweight armor, they would copy their suppressed weapons. This was the fundamental, fatal mistake. The Soviets saw a helicopter, a rifle, and a pair of goggles. They failed to see the system behind it. They failed to see the doctrine. They were looking at the what, and completely missed the how and the why. They could not understand that the true weapon was not the technology, it was the operator. It was the new American philosophy of empowering a single, highly trained soldier with the technology, the intelligence, and the authority to make battlefield decisions in real time. While the Soviet Union's best minds were busy trying to clone a microchip from 1979, the real Delta Force was back in the shadows, training, evolving, and preparing for the next war, a war their enemy didn't even know had begun. While the generals in Moscow built fortresses against phantoms, and the engineers at the Optica Bureau meticulously reverse-engineered microchips from the Iranian desert, the source of their paranoia was running drills in the Pine Barrens of North Carolina. The truth was not a piece of hardware, it was a man and an idea. The shift in perspective begins not in a high-tech lab, but in the smoke-filled bureaucratic halls of the Pentagon in the mid-1970s. The United States, licking its wounds from Vietnam, was a superpower without a scalpel. The world was changing. The battlefield was no longer a jungle in Southeast Asia or a plain in Central Europe. It was an airport tarmac in Munich in 1972. It was a hijacked airliner in Entebbe in 1976. It was an embassy hallway, a diplomat's residence, a corporation's boardroom. The new enemy was terrorism. A small group of men with Kalashnikovs and a political grievance could hold the world hostage. And the American military, an industrial age behemoth of divisions and carrier groups, had absolutely no answer. The conventional army's response to a hostage crisis was to establish a perimeter. The Marines would secure the embassy. But neither had a standing force capable of a direct action. Surgical rescue. The Green Berets, the Army's elite, were trained for unconventional warfare, training foreign armies, leading guerrilla fighters not for the split-second, close-quarters battle required to save a life. Into this vacuum stepped Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith. Beckwith was not a typical officer. He was a gruff, outspoken, cigar-chomping infantryman from Georgia. A Green Beret who had commanded the top-secret Project Delta in Vietnam, running long-range reconnaissance missions deep in enemy territory. But the defining experience of his life came not in Vietnam, but in England. In 1962, Beckwith had been an exchange officer with the British Army's 22nd Special Air Service, the SAS. What he saw there changed him forever. The SAS was not like any unit he had ever seen. Its selection process was a brutal, Darwinian filter, designed to find not the strongest or fastest man, but the most relentless. He saw a philosophy built not on blind obedience, but on an almost arrogant level of individual competence. SAS troopers were expected to be masters of everything: demolitions, communications, medicine, infiltration, and to operate in four-man teams without supervision, hundreds of miles from help. They were taught to think, to adapt, to solve impossible problems alone. Beckwith returned to the United States with a singular obsession: America needed its own SAS. For more than a decade, he was a voice in the wilderness. He pushed his impossible idea on a bureaucracy that had no box to put it in. The big army generals, obsessed with the looming tank battle against the Warsaw Pact at the Fulda Gap, saw his proposal as a special project, a drain on resources. "We train soldiers, Charlie," one general told him, "not a bunch of prima donna assassins." But the television images from Munich, and then the stunningly successful Israeli raid on Entebbe, finally broke the dam. The Pentagon's leadership, terrified of an American Entebbe, realized Beckwith was not a crank. He was a prophet. In November of 1977, he was given his charter. He was given a few dilapidated wooden buildings in a remote corner of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a place that would become known only as the Farm, and a mandate: build the unit. He called it 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta. This is where the American ingenuity, the true source of the Soviet confusion, becomes clear. The Soviets assumed the Americans had started with technology. Beckwith started with the man. His selection process was modeled on the SAS, but perfected for the American soldier. It was a psychological crucible disguised as a physical test. Candidates, mostly senior NCOs and captains from the Green Berets and Ranger battalions, were not told what they were applying for. They simply showed up. The selection began with standard physical tests. But then the candidates were put on a bus, driven to the middle of the Appalachian wilderness, and given a map, a compass, a 40-pound rucksack, and a set of coordinates. The command was simple. Find this point. This was the Long Walk. It was a series of grueling land navigation courses, day and night, in miserable weather, over punishing terrain. It was not a race. It was a test of integrity, intelligence, and individual will. A man would be alone for 18 hours, freezing, soaked, and lost. Would he cheat? Would he take a shortcut? Would he panic? Or would he calmly recalculate, check his compass, and keep moving? Many of the strongest men, the physical studs, were the first to quit. Their bodies were strong, but their minds broke. Beckwith wasn't looking for muscle. He was looking for thought. He was looking for the man who could function and think when he was at the absolute limit of his physical and mental endurance. The final test was a board of psychiatrists and senior operators. The candidate, exhausted and sleep-deprived, would be sat in a chair and psychologically dismantled. His motivations, his fears, his personal life, everything was questioned. The goal was to find the quiet professional. They were filtering out the Rambos, the thrill-seekers, the men who needed to prove something. They were selecting for maturity, stability, and intelligence. The men who passed this trial were the Delta operators, and only then did the technology matter. At the farm, they built the Killing House. It was a maze of rooms and hallways where the operators trained for the new battlefield, the inside of a building. They practiced close-quarters battle, CQB, until it was muscle memory. They fired tens of thousands of rounds. They learned to breach a door and dominate a room in less than a second, distinguishing between a hostage and a terrorist, a threat and a non-threat, and placed 2 shots, center mass, with surgical precision. This was the doctrine the Soviets could not comprehend. Spetsnaz were trained for sabotage, blowing up a bridge, a depot, a command post. They were a tool of mass warfare. Delta was trained for rescue, an infinitely more complex task. You couldn't just throw a grenade into a room full of hostages. This new mission drove the technology. The lightweight body armor, it allowed for the speed and agility needed to clear a room. The modified car 15 seconds. They were shorter, for use in the tight confines of a hallway or an airplane aisle. The custom 1,911 pistols. They were chosen by the operators themselves, who were treated as master craftsmen, not as interchangeable cogs. The operators were their own gunsmiths, tuning their triggers, sights, and grips, because they, the individual, were responsible for the mission's success. And the night vision goggles. The AN divided by PVS 5 seconds that so terrified the technicians in Moscow. They were not just issued to Delta, they were integrated. The operators spent weeks training in total darkness, learning to drive, shoot, and clear rooms with them. The goggles became an extension of their bodies. They owned the night not because the goggles were magic, but because the operators had trained to a level of mastery the Soviets couldn't even imagine. This was the true American solution. It was the fusion of the right man, the right training, and the right technology. It was a system built on individual initiative and decentralized trust. A Delta operator on a mission had the intent rescue the hostages, but he had the authority to make any decision in a split second to achieve it. A Spetsnaz trooper had a plan handed down from a colonel, and his job was to execute that plan. If the plan failed, he failed. When the call came for Operation Eagle Claw, the Iran hostage rescue Delta Force was less than 2 years old. The operation was a complex, multi-service catastrophe. A sudden dust storm, a hydraulic failure in one helicopter, a pilot error, a collision. It was a failure of command structure, of aviation planning, of weather. But as the men of Delta boarded the Cone 130 seconds to leave the burning wreckage of Desert One, they were not a defeated unit. They had done their job. They had reached the staging point. They had been ready. And they had walked away, leaving behind only machines. The Soviets picked up the machines and thought they had found the secret. They were wrong. The secret, the true weapon, was already back at Fort Bragg, cleaning his rifle and planning the next drill. The true confrontation, the moment the Phantom took on a terrifyingly solid form, did not happen in a secret briefing room. It happened on a tiny, sun-drenched Caribbean island in October of 1983. The island was Grenada. To the Soviet Union, Grenada was a small but significant geopolitical chip, a new Marxist-Leninist client state in America's backyard. Moscow had sent advisors. Their Cuban allies had sent thousands of construction workers, many of whom were active military reservists, to build a massive 10,000-foot runway at Point Salines. This runway, the Soviets knew, was strategically vital. It would allow Cuban MiGs and Soviet long-range naval patrol aircraft to refuel, projecting power deep into the South Atlantic. When a violent internal coup rocked the island, the Reagan administration saw its chance. On the 25th of October 1983, Operation Urgent Fury was launched. In Moscow, the GRU and the Politburo watched, expecting a replay of the Bay of Pigs, a clumsy, conventional, and politically disastrous amphibious landing. The Soviet and Cuban advisors on the ground, many of them veterans, prepared for a traditional assault. They fortified the beaches. They zeroed their mortars on the obvious landing zones. They positioned their Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns to repel slow-moving helicopter formations. They were ready for a 1950s-style invasion. What they got, instead, was a terrifying glimpse of the 1980s. The first reports that filtered back to the Soviet embassy, and from there, in frantic, coded bursts to Moscow, were pure chaos. The Americans had not landed on the beaches. At dawn, a squadron of low-flying Cone 130 seconds, coming in so low they were invisible to radar until the last second, had roared over Point Salines. Before the Cuban anti-aircraft crews could even get to their guns, hundreds of American soldiers had fallen out of the sky. This was the 1st and 2nd Ranger Battalions. This was not a static line parachute jump from 1,500 feet. This was a combat jump from an altitude of just 500 feet, a brutally fast, aggressive insertion designed to put an overwhelming force on the objective in seconds. The Rangers hit the ground, and in less than 3 hours they had seized the entire airfield, captured the Cuban defenders, and cleared the runway for follow-on forces. The Soviet advisors were stunned. This was not the clumsy, conscript-heavy American army of Vietnam. This was something fast, lethal, and professional. But this was only the first shock. While the Rangers were taking the airfield, other stranger reports came in. There had been an assault on Richmond Hill Prison, an attempt to rescue political prisoners. The assault had been a failure, the attacking force pinned down, but the nature of the force was what baffled the observers. They were not in standard uniform. They were shadow men, using strange tactics, who had arrived in helicopters that seemed to defy the laws of physics. These were the Night Stalkers, the 160th Aviation Battalion, a top-secret unit created from the ashes of Desert One. They flew helicopters painted black, modified for nap of the Earth, all-weather, nighttime insertion, flown by the best pilots in the US Army. And the men they were carrying were Delta. This was the shock moment. It arrived on Anatoly Grishin's desk, not as a single report, but as a mosaic of terrifying, disconnected data points from Grenada. The GRU analysts, the ones who had spent 3 years staring at the Desert One photos, finally understood. Their blood ran cold. The goggles were not just an experiment. The ghosts from Iran were not a CIA assassination team. The lightweight armor was not a curiosity. It was all real, and it was all connected. Desert One was not a probe. It was a dress rehearsal. The Americans had not been testing their technology. They had been testing their new doctrine. And in the 3 years since that failure, they had perfected it. They had created an entire ecosystem of special warfare. The Rangers were the door kickers, a light infantry sledgehammer to seize a strategic objective like an airfield. The 160th were the magic carpet, a logistics and insertion unit that owned the night. And Delta was the scalpel, the surgical tool for the impossible missions, the hostage rescues, the decapitation strikes. The theories that had circulated in Moscow, the KGB plot, the technology trap, all evaporated. The truth was far worse. The Americans had not just built a unit, they had built a system, a flexible, integrated, and terrifyingly effective Special Operations Command. The Soviet response was immediate, predictable, and utterly futile. The order came down from the Minister of Defense: "We must have this." The GRU and KGB were given a blank check. The budgets for their own elite units, Spetsnaz Vimpel, KGB Foreign Sabotage, and Alpha Group, KGB Domestic Counter-Terror, were tripled. This was the great countermeasure. If the Americans had a scalpel, the Soviets would sharpen their axe. They poured money into technology. Engineers at the TSNII Tokmash Institute were ordered to accelerate development of new, specialized weapons. The result was the AS Val, an integrally suppressed assault rifle, and the VSS Vintorez, a suppressed sniper rifle. These were, by any measure, excellent weapons. They developed new body armor, the 6B series, and better night vision. Alpha and Vimpel operators were trained to a razor's edge. They were masters of demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, and parachuting. They were, without question, among the most formidable special forces on Earth. But they failed to counter Delta. The failure was not one of skill, or courage, or even technology. The AS Val was arguably more advanced than the Kar-15. The failure was one of philosophy. The Soviet system, built on absolute centralized control, could not create a Delta operator. It could only create a perfect Spetsnaz trooper. A Spetsnaz trooper was a loyal, supremely conditioned instrument of the state. He was given a mission: destroy the NATO command bunker at grid 48.6, and a hyper-detailed plan. His job was to execute that plan perfectly. A Delta operator was a problem solver. He was given an objective: rescue the hostages and the autonomy to achieve it. The entire American JSOC system was built on trust, decentralized command, and individual initiative. It was built on the idea that the staff sergeant on the ground, in the killing house, knows more about the tactical situation than the general in the command bunker 1,000 miles away. This was an idea that was, in its own way, more revolutionary and more terrifying to the Soviet leadership than a nuclear missile. It was an idea they could not copy. They could reverse engineer a microchip. They could clone a helicopter. They could even design a better suppressed rifle. But they could not clone a culture. They could not manufacture trust. While Alpha and Vimpel were practicing to perfection a plan handed to them by a KGB colonel, Delta was training to improvise when the plan inevitably fell apart. The Soviets had built an invincible hammer. The Americans had built a self-guiding, autonomous thinking missile. The Phantom from Desert One was finally in focus, and the men in Moscow realized with dawning horror that they had no weapon to fight it. The ultimate verdict on this shadowy conflict is not found in a battlefield statistic, because these two forces, built for entirely different wars, never met in open combat. The killer statistic is not a number. It is a question: why, in the final desperate decade of its existence, with a defense budget that was bleeding its economy white, did the Soviet Union never produce an equivalent to Delta Force? The answer is the most profound impact of all. It is because they could not. It was not for lack of will. It was not for lack of resources, and it was certainly not for lack of brave or capable men. The operators of Vimpel and Alpha Group were supremely tough, skilled, and dedicated. But they were, and would always be, instruments of a centralized paranoid state. The proof is in their deployment. As the 1980s careened towards their chaotic end, the American JSOC, with Delta at its tip, was becoming a global, extrajudicial fire brigade. They were in Panama for Operation Just Cause, hunting a dictator. They were in the deserts of Iraq, hunting Scud missiles. They were a force of projection. And what of Alpha and Vimpel? They were not in Afghanistan, hunting Stinger missile teams. They were not deployed to Africa, rescuing Soviet advisors. In January of 1991, as the Soviet Union was tearing itself apart, Alpha Group was ordered into Vilnius, Lithuania. Their mission was not a hostage rescue. It was to seize the TV tower and the broadcast center, to crush a popular independence movement. They were a tool of internal suppression. The same year, Vimpel operators, the foreign sabotage experts, were reportedly on the streets of Moscow, their mission to support a hardline coup against their own government. This is the final, damning verdict. The Soviet system could only create a force to protect the state from its own people. The American system, in its relentless pursuit of a counter-terrorist scalpel, had accidentally created a force that embodied a philosophical advantage. This was the macro theme, the great systemic failure of the Soviet experiment, played out in miniature. It was the fatal flaw of imitation versus innovation. The Soviet economy was a miracle of reverse engineering. It was built on the premise that a centralized committee of brilliant men could plan an economy. They could identify what the West had and order their factories to build one too. When the Americans built the B-29 bomber, the Soviets captured 3, disassembled them, and created the Tupolev Tu-4. It was a perfect bolt-for-bolt copy. When the Americans built the atomic bomb, Soviet spies stole the plans, and the Kurchatov Institute delivered an identical device. This system was brutally effective at copying things. It could produce more tanks, more artillery, and more nuclear warheads than its adversary. But Delta Force was not a thing. It was not a helicopter, or a rifle, or a pair of goggles. The Soviets had collected all the pieces from the desert, but they had completely missed the blueprint. Delta Force was a culture. It was a human system. It was a system built on the radical, and to the Soviet mind, anarchic idea of decentralized trust. It was a culture where the after-action review, AAR, was a sacred ritual of brutal, rankless honesty. A captain could, and was expected to, stand up and tell a colonel, "Sir, your plan was flawed, and here is why." That captain would be promoted. His Soviet equivalent, pointing out a flaw in his colonel's plan, would be sent to a motor rifle division in Siberia. The American system, for all its bureaucratic flaws, had created a learning loop. Delta failed at Desert One. That failure was analyzed, dissected, and learned from. The result was the 160th SAW, the Night Stalkers, and a unified Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. The system evolved. The Soviet system calcified. It could copy the PVS-5 goggles, but it could not copy the culture of relentless self-criticism that had invented them. It could build a fortress, but it could not adapt to an enemy who refused to attack it. This was the intellectual arms race that the Soviet Union lost. They were stuck playing checkers while the Americans, almost by accident, had started playing chess. In the end, the true phantom that haunted the halls of the GRU was not a man in black body armor. It was an idea. The analyst, Anatoly Grishin, now a retired general, living in a modest apartment outside Moscow, would later write in his unpublished memoirs that the Cold War was not won by Star Wars or the stealth bomber. Those were just symptoms. The war was won by the operator. The Soviet Union spent its last trillion rubles trying to build machines to counter American machines. They bankrupted their empire in a desperate race to match the hardware, to build a bigger missile, a faster jet, a quieter submarine. They believed the battle was one of concrete and steel, of megatons and microchips. They never understood that the impossible event at Desert One had revealed a different kind of gap. It was not a goggle gap or a helicopter gap. It was a trust gap. The true, unassailable weapon of American dominance was not a piece of technology. It was the simple, revolutionary belief that the most powerful force on any battlefield is not the plan and not the machine, but a single, well-trained, intelligent individual empowered with the freedom to think. It was a weapon the Soviet Union could see and could fear, but could never, ever build. And in the face of that phantom, their entire mighty edifice, built on a foundation of centralized control and systemic fear, was destined to collapse into dust.